Good morning for 8 minutes. There you go. Okay, so we will go ahead and start our second keynote. It's been good so far, right? It's been a good morning so far. Awesome. So we are really excited to have Lena Raine here this morning. She's a composer and producer of original music and game soundtracks, best known for her work on the games Celeste, Guild Wars, and Hackmud. She's also released electronic music under the name Karain, including her debut EP, nominated for the IGF 2018. I'm sorry, I jumped. Singularity. There we go. I jumped. Sorry. The soundtrack for Celeste was nominated for the IGF 2018 Excellence in Audio Award. So we're really happy to have Lena here. So without further ado, Shaped by Limitations.
Hi, thanks for coming. I was going to introduce myself, but it seems that that's been taken care of for me. But I'm going to talk about how game music is defined by its venue and how composers can take advantage of that to create interesting music, lean into the limitations of music for games, and make it shine both in the game and outside of it. There's the subtitle. So here's the part where I was going to talk about myself for a sec, but I don't need to do a lot of that. I'm a composer for games. I've been working in the industry for about 12 years. I got a lot of attention because of the soundtrack to Celeste, which came out, the game itself and soundtrack came out in January. And I've written for a whole bunch of other things, games, including that. But also, I am a game designer and writer, so I have a bit of an odd background. I worked for about 6 years as a game designer on Guild Wars 2. Worked on the base game, its live content after ship, both of the expansions so far. And then I also worked for about a year as a level designer on Far Cry 5, which just came out. And I'm also a writer. I do way too many things. I've published a book, City of Tigers. I've published several short stories, and am currently working on my first interactive novel, Escape. But mostly, let's just talk about music right now. So I want to talk about what I mean by music as defined by a venue. The basis for this line of thinking comes from this really cool book by David Byrne of the Talking Heads called How Music Works. In the opening chapter, he discusses this concept of music being defined by the venue it's meant for or being performed in. He writes, in a sense, we work backwards, either consciously or unconsciously, creating work that fits the venue available to us. So to kind of go over what he means by this, the first thing is, consider a space. Consider this room, for example. A space defines its acoustics. So when you create a space, you are defining sort of how sound moves throughout this space. And so the acoustics also go towards defining music. What kind of music is performed well in those spaces? So for example, chamber music, when it was created literally for chambers, there was not a whole lot of reverb. Instruments could play sort of quick, freely moving things and sort of in a close, intimate experience. However, religious music meant to be played in cathedrals and big, choirs and organs and all of that. They took advantage of the acoustics and the fact that sound was going to be reverberating for basically forever. And so you have a lot more just longer, drawn-out notes and chords and things that sort of take advantage of that space. A space defines the amount of instruments it can hold and what types of instruments it can hold. You can only really perform organ music in a cathedral that has an organ. For a small stage for a jazz venue, you can hold so many instruments on there. And the instrument choice also defines the kind of music that you're going to be playing in that space. Another thing that's important about space is it defines its audience. There's social implications for a certain space. There are all sorts of size things, as well as the audience participation or lack thereof. A lot of earlier music, like very early music, was, the venue was outdoors in a community. There was a lot of just, everyone bringing in their instruments and playing together and being this sort of communal thing. And so audience participation was encouraged and, definitely sought after for everyone to kind of get in there and be an active participant in that music. Whereas you have something like orchestral concert music, the expectation was shifted, primarily for social reasons to, be still and quiet and just kind of appreciate the music. But if you go to like a concert or something, like the audience is dancing, the audience is shouting back at the band playing or whatever. So the venue also kind of goes towards the social implications of the audience and like what they're expected, how they're expected to participate in the music. So how does this apply to game music? Well, you could take the concept of a venue and perhaps apply it to a game console. And for very early consoles, they sort of were their own venues for music. So in the case of the Famicom, I would use the NES, but the Famicom looks cooler on a slide, so I'm going to use that. It can serve as a venue in certain ways, and primarily because of its hardware. So you have a certain number of things that are defined by this hardware and how it's able to output audio and define audience interaction. Audio is, the outputs define the listening experience. So you have perhaps a speaker on your TV that's built in. It's probably mono if it's the Famicom, and that's defining sort of the way that the music is presented to you. The chipset also defines its instruments. So you have on the Famicom a total of 4 voices, 2 pulse waves, 1 triangle wave, and 1 noise wave, or noise channel, and they can also play back samples. So it's defining what instruments are available in this space. And it's also defining how many notes can be played simultaneously, which is also 4. So it's creating all of these restrictions that then go on to define the music being written for it. The games also define their audience and the interaction with the game. In the case of the Famicom, about 1 to 2 players engaging with a minimally interactive playback for the music. And so that's an example if you were to apply that theory to, for example, a game console. But that doesn't necessarily apply now because there aren't as many limitations hardware-wise on the music that can be played back on a modern console or a PC or any sort of modern gaming equivalent. So to sort of go back and discuss that a little bit, here's sort of how music playback has developed over the years. We started with simple chip-based waveforms. There was a limited number of voices that could play at once. But then as things advanced, there were an increase in simultaneous voices. There was the introduction of sample-based playback. So you're suddenly getting more actual real instruments introduced. There's also a fun thing with MIDI data for audio playback, which enabled a dynamic playback of music. And that's a really important one, which we'll go back to later, because the dynamism of music plays into the strengths of video games. And then we get to sort of the last main development in game audio playback, which is CD quality audio. Suddenly you've got Redbook audio. You can play back pretty much anything that's been recorded, and hardware limitations in a general sense have reached recording quality. So does that mean limitations are gone then for writing music for games? No, definitely not, because so much about games themselves have continued to change and will continue to change in the future. So let's go back to this list. As we've advanced beyond the sophistication of music playback, we've been able to reflect on the way audio technology has developed. So going sort of in this point-by-point development, a reflection on that would be for the chip-based sounds, we now sort of regard that as a unique chiptune sound, right? We've sort of taken that limitation and it's defined it into something that is sort of well regarded in games and in also just kind of music in general. For the limited amount of voices playing at once, that actually created compositional advantages. So a lot of composers writing games, or game music with this limitation, were employing a whole lot of compositional techniques such as counterpoint and developing really strong melodies and melodies that were able to repeat over and over again without getting repetitious. You were able to essentially use the strengths of the limitations given. As more instruments were introduced, or the amount of instruments being able to play simultaneously were increased, you kind of got a sense of a compositional equivalence between writing for, say, an orchestra or a film score or something, and writing for a game score. But then also the creator-defined instruments are only as good as the source material. So if you're creating samples to be played back in a game, suddenly the audio quality of those samples is mattering more and more. And the MIDI MIDI dynamism, it creates a unique flavor back to game scores. It allows them to take advantage of that. But then CD audio complicates dynamism. As soon as CD-based consoles were introducing all of these tracks just on CDs, suddenly you were just getting a sort of a wallpaperification of game music. You had games where you'd start the level and you'd hear a little bit of loading sound. The CD would kind of, spin up, and then the music would play, and then it would finish, and then it would go back on loop and play again. So CD quality audio kind of complicated that dynamism, but it also started opening up the doors as far as the audio quality for music. So how modern music is now taking, modern game music is now taking those advantages from both things and combining them. We have, CD quality audio that is being sort of brought through the same processes as MIDI data had been on previous iterations of game music. And so the defining feature of games is more obvious when you refer to it as interactive software. We interact with it. Even though you might consider it a linear game where the most basic interactive thing you do is sort of proceed to advance the text or to just read through something, you open the possibility for a nonlinear decision loop that, when scored by music, has to be taken into consideration. So game music is never linear, and the audience is always involved in its playback. So in the case of game music, the venue through which you're performing is the game itself. Music for games is defined by when and how you interact. That's the key information that you can take away from games if you're using them as a model of a venue through which you're performing your music. So why does this matter? You're probably thinking, defining things is fun, but how does this actually apply towards writing and incorporating music into games? So let's consider the strengths of what happens when you use the venue of games to inform your decisions when composing. A well-considered dynamism in music rewards play. If you are doing things and changing up the music to reflect the actual experience that the player is going through, then you are essentially adding to the reward loop for the game. You're incentivizing the player to keep going because things are changing, the music is evolving, and it's scoring their performance. And that's a really important thing to take into consideration when you're using music as such an important part of games, is that the music is not scoring the game. The music is scoring the player's experience. So what the player is doing in the game, that is what the music is reacting to. Game design also impacts the music as much as story and narrative, because those are the things that hook off of the interaction. In the example of Celeste, like you're playing through a level and very basic example, there's a level that has a hotel with a whole lot of locked doors and keys that you find that unlock more and more of the hotel. So as you are unlocking doors, it's actually unlocking more of the music. You are sort of unlocking the score by means of using the gameplay method of unlocking doors. And then finally, compositional quality is important, but implementation is even more important. Specifically, when you get to music that has been composed in such a way that it is emotionally rich, and all of these things are being taken into consideration, but it doesn't necessarily match the gameplay. It doesn't necessarily match the experience that the player is having. One example that I can come up with that struck me was the game Ni no Kuni 2. Is scored by Joe Hisaishi, who worked on all the Ghibli films. He is an amazing composer and has just a wealth of orchestral writing skills to bring to a game. But unfortunately, in the case of the game, it's more of this sort of wallpaper presentation for it. So you have these sections where he's written this gorgeous sweeping narrative, and it's kind of, you can even sense while he was writing, he was sort of keeping these things in his head, like this sort of the emotional arc of the game, but then it's used as background music for just exploring an area. And suddenly you have a situation where you're just standing still, kind of like looking at a canyon or something, and then suddenly all this emotional stuff is happening, but you're like, what? I don't understand what's actually going on. Like, it's just background music. And so if that was, for example, taken as something that was used as dynamic music, and all those sweeping things were sort of like triggered by, okay, here's this vista, and your emotions are sort of lifted by seeing the vista and also this sweeping music. Like, that is suddenly a far greater experience than just letting a piece of wallpaper music kind of drift on in the background. So I wanted to take everything that I've talked about so far and use it in an example, specifically from the game that I'm working on finishing up here, called Escape. So when I worked on this game, I was essentially working for myself as my own client. So I designed and wrote this game and then went back and was like, okay, well, I'm going to score it. So I wanted to take a look at what is this game, what are the sort of advantages that I could take, that I could use to score this game. So I looked at all of the sort of the bullet point, list of like what is this involved? What are the limitations here? It's a linear interactive novel. There's not a whole lot of player choice in it. It's mostly playing things out, reading through text, minimally interacting with it to sort of enhance the experience of the text. It's presented as text is the primary form of expression. So everything kind of revolves around how the text is presented and what is accompanying it. The visuals and sound serve the text, so everything needed to take that into consideration. The gameplay involves typing and advancing text, so as the sort of bare minimum of like what is the actual interaction in this game. This is how you're interacting with it. These are the things that would then advance the music if you were, for example, doing something and advancing the text and things are changing because you're doing this. At a very basic level, that is the gameplay involved. And also one of the other restrictions that I didn't actually put into a bullet point is it was being made in GameMaker 2, which has not a very robust set of audio tools, and I wasn't using any sort of middleware, or I wasn't using Fmod or Wwise or any of those sorts of tools to deal with the audio implementation. So I had to sort of write things that could be dealt well with the audio implementation within the engine itself, which, to note, is basically play music or adjust the audio level of music and stop music. So that's the sort of basic controls that I had over the music and how it was played back. So to give this example from one of the chapters of the game, this chapter called Trains. And so there are some very specific thematic things involved in this chapter. I knew that there's a train horn. There was sort of a key sound effect that sort of keeps coming back as sort of both a narrative as well as sound design element. In the text, the characters are described harmonizing with this train horn. They are sort of in a stressful situation and, using just kind of this repetitive train horn as kind of a calming thing for them, just kind of like laughing and harmonizing with this train to just kind of, let themselves unwind a bit. And so I knew that was sort of an important thematic element for the text. And then also there are sort of 3 different intensity levels that ramp up during the course of the chapter. In terms of the pacing, in terms of everything that sort of encompasses the narrative that I wanted to write, this sort of set-piece track that encompassed the entire chapter. So I went ahead and sort of defined the key musical components that I wanted to write for this. I knew I wanted to make it dynamic. I knew I wanted to do something with the interactivity for it. And so I defined essentially a number of loops that I was going to use because that was sort of the key method of playing back music in GameMaker 2, which was to have a whole bunch of loops that could either be stacked on top of each other or transitioned through fade-outs, through fade-ins, those sorts of things. So I'm actually going to play some of these so you can get sort of the basic building blocks, and then I'll play through the actual presentation of how the level sort of or chapter plays out based on these elements that I was using to construct the music for it. So you have the bass intensity, and it introduces the material. All of this is very simple stuff. It's about 30-second loops. Getting sort of a bass layer going, right? I'm going to turn down the volume because these ones are not balanced. So then I had some harmonies here. So these are the representation of the harmonization that the characters are doing with the train horns as they're being played. And then another one. So you have sort of 2 layers of harmony that are going. And it's going to all layer on top of sort of the bass layers themselves because they're all part of the same loop, they're all part of the same sort of time frame that is playing back. And so then we've got the medium intensity, which, whoops, that's not it. There we go. Introduces a bit of a beat to it. Ramps things up. More intense than drum beat that's going on the second one, but it has this big pulse and bass to it that is creating this ominous feel that's sort of leading to the very evolution of this narrative arc. So, what does all this look in context? If I can, there we go. I've got a lovely YouTube video. I know. If this will actually load. Let's find out. And apologies if you can't really read through the text. I'm going kind of fast just so you can kind of get the presentation. This is sort of towards the tail end of the game. So there's a lot of stuff you probably understand. Got that bass layer going, right? Mirroring the train horn that's being played. basically both of those layers have been playing in the background in time, and I just upped the volume of it once it became relevant in the text. And then the second harmony layer comes in. And then the layers just kind of fade out as it gets to transition time. So then using the train horn to kind of mask the ramp up on the next layer that's I'm doing another fade out to get into the transition here. And if I was using something like Fmod, I'd be able to bridge that gap a little more cleanly than just doing kind of a fade out here to the next intensity. Harmonizing again to bring up those layers. This kind of transitions out with the last horn. So yeah, that's an example of kind of using all of those considerations to score a relatively simple bit of gameplay, which is essentially reading through text, but it kind of allows you to sort of break down those very simple building blocks of like how to consider text, how to consider gameplay, and how to consider the music that you're writing for it. So I kind of went over all of these points while I was talking through, so I don't need to go through there. Actually. Recreated the background transition there because I could, and PowerPoint's fun. So there's one more subject I want to touch on before I wrap this up. And it has to do with a very common magic trick that composers need to pull, which is transforming nonlinear music into a linear soundtrack album. And I feel like in a lot of ways, the soundtrack album is kind of a very unfortunately, like underappreciated, underused way to take music that's written for games and present it in a way that is sort of equivalent to the experience of playing a game. And by using that comparison of music for a venue, when you're using the game as a venue, you're writing a very specific kind of music. It is nonlinear. It is, doing all these things that rely on interactions. However, when you present that in the form of a soundtrack, you're suddenly creating music for a different venue. The recorded, album is a very different way of experiencing music. You don't have the audience participation. It's just a linear thing that's being played through. So A case for soundtracks. There's a lot of ways to do this. A lot of composers don't really consider soundtracks until it's all done, until everything's been released. In my personal opinion, this is just how I approach things. I feel like it kind of puts the soundtrack release at a disadvantage, not for any fault of the composer or anyone involved, but because ultimately their job is to score the game. However, a couple of things in favor of soundtracks. A good game soundtrack will be listened to for hundreds and hundreds of hours after the player has completed the game. It fuels their nostalgia for the game, brings them back into that experience. They can relive moments from the game in their head, re-experiencing those emotions that they felt while playing through, if the music particularly spoke to them. And then people who've never actually played your game can listen to and get the equivalent experience of playing through, and then also be introduced to the game itself. And this definitely happened a lot with the example of Celeste. A whole lot of people kind of discovered that music first, and then they're like, oh, well, I should play through this game, and they've picked it up, and sort of become this sort of multi-approach way of getting people to play the game, but also appreciate the music for it. And then there's also opportunities beyond the game itself that can become available. Two examples that have been drawn exactly from my experience over the past couple of months is I was invited to go on KEXP, a local radio station in Seattle. They played some of my music on there, interviewed me, and they one of the DJs there is a huge fan of it, so he's been playing some of the tracks just from the soundtrack on the air, and using that as sort of it's another venue through which the music is being experienced. And then also live performance. I was invited to perform live at a music festival in Seattle later in the summer, and that is just another experience that you can sort of channel that music into if it's being sort of considered for multiple venues at once. And so how I personally write for nonlinear and linear music simultaneously is kind of mostly just a personal approach and how I deal with things. But I consider the elements that make up music, especially when I'm writing things for a dynamic soundtrack. Nonlinear music generally consists of these four things: loops, stings, intros, and outros. And thankfully, linear music uses all these same components. These are all building blocks you can construct a piece of music out of. And so when you are writing music for a game, for example, you can, the way that I approach it is I write music as if I'm going to be performing it. Because in a lot of ways, when the game is playing back the music, it's a performance. It's performing the music, the bits of music that I've assembled for it to play back. And when I'm assembling a recording, I am performing for the recording. I am taking those same elements and I'm using them to create a piece of music that is through composed instead of nonlinear. And so you can then deconstruct and ambiguate music if you've written it for a linear perspective to write it linear first and incorporate it into a dynamic soundtrack. Or you can reassemble dynamic elements for playback, composing a new track essentially out of the pieces that you've assembled. I was going to play an example of that same piece that I wrote for the game in sort of the linear soundtrack form. I unfortunately was not smart and didn't put it online or on this computer. However, to talk about it just kind of ambiguously, for that soundtrack, I actually took all of those pieces of the music and even the horn sounds themselves, made them slightly less, out there, but kind of used all of those and created this sort of progressive piece of electronic dance music essentially out of those components and made this sort of, through composed thing out of those dynamic elements that were initially just little 31-second loops. If you played those back to back on a soundtrack, it'd be like, okay, whatever, that doesn't sound super great. But when you assemble them into a piece of music that has been considered as a linear piece of music, suddenly you have something that's far more presentable in a soundtrack form. So, to recap, music is defined by the conscious and unconscious decisions composers make when considering writing for a chosen venue. Games as a venue define when the audience interacts and how they interact. taking advantage of knowing how the game defines these factors can lead to a stronger score. A game soundtrack album is a different venue to consider than a game. And composing while thinking of both venues and their needs can lead to both a stronger score and a stronger album. And now I can open up for some questions if you would like to ask any. Yeah.
Two questions.
Sure.
Excuse me. One of them being, can you describe the relationship between, like I said, composing and also design aspects, like on Celeste, like
Mhm.
like, do you have any tricks like filtering or looping?
Sure. So the question is comparing is it the experience or between composing and design on Celeste.
I was wondering like what the relationship.
Oh, the relationship, yeah. So yeah, for Celeste in specific, I worked really closely with the designers on it. It was a pretty small team, so we were all kind of in a group chat together and kind of discussing things as designs were coming together. I was in really early. I was on about a year and a half out of the 2-year development cycle for it. So I was in there playing like rough prototype versions of the levels and kind of getting some idea of what the mechanics were like before they were finalized and kind of coming together. I also got to see the structure of the levels as they were being put together, so I knew kind of the narrative arc as well as the structural arc of those levels that I was scoring, and was able to sort of suggest things while everything was coming together. And they actually used some of the compositional ideas that I was coming up with to kind of reflect that onto the game itself as well. So there was definitely like whole lot of back and forth going on with the design of that game and the composing as well. Yeah, more questions? Yeah.
When you're arranging a soundtrack, are you like trying to take the listener through the same journey that the player does when they're playing? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the question is, when I'm arranging a soundtrack, do I try to take the player through the same journey, or the listener is through the same journey as the player would be through the game? And yeah, extremely. Like, I think, it depends on the soundtrack, I guess. Like, if it's something that's a little more ambiguous than a linear narrative sort of game, like it would probably be presented in a different way. But for the games I like to work on, which are very narrative focused and very kind of a developing experience as you go through it, like I definitely want to present the soundtrack as the narrative arc of the game and to sort of make those equivalent experiences so that when you're listening through again, you're either being introduced to the same kind of flow as the game, or are remembering through it as you're listening through.
kind of as a follow-up, when you
Sure.
perform live, are you doing the same arrangement, or are you kind of feeling the crowd?
Right. So the question is, when I'm performing live, do I do the same arrangement, or am I sort of feeling the crowd? That's a good question. I'll let you know once I have performed live. I've not actually performed electronic music live until this show that's coming up, so I'm definitely going to be figuring that out. But I'm for sure going to be putting together like unique sets and sort of versions of the songs, because just playing through it, just hitting play on a laptop, like that's not interesting to listen to live. So, sort of creating that experience through the playback of it, I think is going to be interesting. For example, like I'll probably like play melodies and stuff live and just kind of improvise on top of things, and just make it a fun performance and not just playing the soundtrack for an audience. Yeah.
When you're working on Escape,
Mhm.
you kind of described the process as you kind of did a lot. It sounded like you did a lot of the writing first, and then
Yeah.
you back to score it.
Mhm.
What was that process kind of like as far as going back and scoring it? Were you kind of taking notes of like composing it as you wrote, or did you try and force yourself to hold that for later? Or?
Sure. The question is, while I was working on both the writing and the music for Escape, was I thinking of the music while I was writing, or vice versa, I guess? And The interesting thing for Escape is I actually wrote the text for it about 5 years ago, before I even knew I was going to make it into an interactive experience. I knew that I wanted it to be that way. I didn't know I wasn't confident enough that I could make it into a game when I wrote it, and so I was like, this would be really cool if you're actually interacting with it. And so I wrote it all just kind of under the assumption that it was just going to be read. And so going back and sort of adapting that text to an interactive format, I didn't have music necessarily in mind while I was writing, and so it was a very sort of unique experience of going back and sort of reflecting, like, okay, what does this actually sound like? And so having that sort of 5-year separation between the creation of the game in a lot of ways and, elaborating it into an interactive experience sort of let me have that objectivity to kind of go in and consider it as sort of, self-client from 5 years ago. Any other questions? Yeah.
So when you're composing music for a game that you don't have in front of you,
Yeah.
What information helps you when composing it? Like what helps you
Mm.
get the designer's vision into music?
Okay. The question is, what information helps me, create the music for a game that's being worked on from scratch, basically. And I'd say playing the game is usually the most helpful thing. Being able to get in there and seeing how everything is laid out and presented, how I feel when I'm playing through it. All of those are sort of the experiences that I take into writing a score. Having conceptual material is also really helpful, but I feel like I don't actually get the sense of what the game needs to sound like until I'm actually in there and experiencing it. And one of the benefits that I've been able to sort of pick up on is since I've worked as a game designer, I know what early game prototypes feel like. I know there's a lot of things that are not going to be final in terms of the polish or the scope or anything. But being able to just get in there and kind of get a sense for what is going to be the emotional content that fuels music, because ultimately music is kind of infusing emotion into a game in a lot of ways. So taking that experiential knowledge and applying that to music. Any more? Yeah.
Yeah, one question.
Sure.
Your synths tend to have a very specific characteristics. Can you talk about your tool chain?
Sure. It's asking me to talk about my tool chain or the synths that I use. Right now, I'm primarily using Massive, which is a synth by Native Instruments. It's a really versatile synth, software synth that I've done a whole lot of work with. I used it on Hackmud and Celeste and Escape. And some of the stuff that I'm working on right now that I can't talk a whole lot about. But it's definitely sort of something that I've really sort of delved into and just gotten an in-depth familiarity with it. And that's kind of how I work best, dealing with either sample libraries or other sort of synth or tools to use to create music, is being able to sort of know them backwards and forwards, and being able to know how to do exactly what I want to do, how to create a sound that I want. And going in from scratch and just making things out of the parameters that I know. So I use that. I also use a lot of different sort of plugins. I compose in Ableton Live. This is my DAW, digital audio workstation. And I pretty much write everything linearly within that, but with also some loops and some various, I use a lot of distortion, compression. I like to make things raw and gritty and just make it sound kind of screwed up. Just a lot of fun for me. So it's a baseline, how I make the sounds that I do. Yeah.
Do you compose any of the issues of yourself?
Hmm.
The NES had the 4 channels.
Right.
Like that?
Yeah, I definitely when I'm feeling out a new game soundtrack, I like to sort of create what I feel is the ensemble for that game. I like to sort of restrain the amount of material that I'm using to create the music with, because I feel like it creates a good sense of identity for the score, and then also kind of allows you to surprise the player with different things to kind of break out of that sound, to sort of an example with Celeste is like most of the soundtrack is composed using a piano and then also a bunch of synths and some sampled drums. So that's kind of like that's the ensemble that I've gathered for that soundtrack. And then there's a certain breaking of expectations when there's something like the final battle that you have with the other self, which is the track Confronting Myself on the soundtrack. I suddenly bring in this like Bulgarian women's choir, and it's this very just kind of othering kind of sensation of like, what's this sound? And so you can use that to sort of your advantage if you created this vocabulary that you're using to construct the music. You can sort of start breaking out of that when you really want to call attention to differences in the score. Any other questions before I wrap up? Yeah.
So you talked about your process of designing the game and then composing the music for it.
Yeah.
So when you're designing it, you just leave the game completely silent, or like do you say like what I do is I always insert like placeholder music from other games.
Yeah.
Like, it's like which route do you take with that?
I would usually prefer to never hear other music when I'm playing through a game. Like I think that can definitely distract away from figuring out sort of what the actual sound that I want to introduce to it. There was actually it was an interesting situation starting on Celeste because Matt, the lead designer on it, like he's also a composer and he's done music for his other games. And so he actually had some temp tracks that he'd written that were in there, and he was like, just ignore those. Just you don't have to follow that style at all. Just you can turn off the music, whatever you want to do to kind of get started. But that also kind of introduced me to some of he had already done some like dynamic stuff in the first level that I was like, okay, well I'll do my own version of that implementation. And so temp stuff I think is good to like sort of get a baseline sense of how you're implementing music before you have anyone on board. But I feel like as soon as there is a composer involved, like just get sketches in there, like get as much music in as possible, even during the early stages of design, even if it's just like, here's something that the composer is playing on piano, right? Here's like this really rough, sort of version of what they're sort of thinking material-wise for the game, like getting it in there, because, the more that you can define what that sound is during the course of development, I think the stronger the whole thing is going to be. Any other questions? We've got plenty of time, so. Yes.
I was wondering if you had any, or I'm sure you do, what are some of your favorite soundtracks or games that you really remember evoking as an emotional experience?
Yeah. Well, I mean, going back to the games that I grew up with, right? Like I played way too many JRPGs for my own good, and so I like Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, are sort of the staples that I always name as sort of those games evoking some really strong emotions. Journey is obviously like a really strong inspiration for sort of tying that gameplay experience to composing the sort of flowing orchestral piece that goes along with it. There's I'm trying to think of any more like specific examples, but RPGs generally have like a very sort of wide range of interesting pieces, and also just kind of like a variety of instruments and sort of playing with genre within a soundtrack. I think that's one thing that's kind of interesting that definitely inspired me a lot growing up and playing through those games, to kind of to move beyond just doing orchestral stuff for a game when you want to have it being epic, right? There's definitely a strength to playing with sounds and sort of ensembles that are not sort of your typical sound, and so there's been a lot of fun examples of sort of playing with genre and sort of ensembles of instruments, like Where the Water Tastes Like Wine is a game that does a really cool thing of just like, here's a bunch of folk songs, right? Here's how the context of this game is scored, and so that's sort of that process, right, of like figuring out what instrument, what's the ensemble going to be like? How is it thematically appropriate for the game, and how is that going to sort of influence what the music is? It's a sort of long, windy answer to your question, but yeah.
Was it, like when you did Escape, was it interesting having yourself as a client? Was that present
Yeah.
any challenges with the traditional like, client relationship?
Well, I couldn't. Well, actually, no. I could tell myself off pretty well without feeling guilty about it. No, it was. It was interesting because it was just sort of my first project, at least in this scope, that I had sort of brought from concept to actually like doing it. In a lot of ways, it wasn't super different from sort of doing a single, a project that involved like one sort of like thing, like writing or just doing an album, right? So, it was kind of the same sort of process of putting together like a manuscript for a novel in a sense, because all of those things are kind of all part of the experience. I just happened to be doing a whole lot more for that. The one thing that was different was being sort of a director on a project and bringing in outside people to help out, because I got help on sound design as well as the art for the game, and so taking a lot of lessons that I learned from being working for someone, and then suddenly being also someone that people were working for. That was definitely something that I kind of had to search through those experiences and do my best to be the best boss I could. So, yeah.
You're a good boss.
Oh, cool. Miller did the sound design for Escape. He did all those cool train sounds, growlings. Any other questions? Okay, yeah.
How do you think about integrating sound design and the soundtrack itself? Is it one of those just like, I know I have this specific sound, but this action might better not have a tom sound, and like soundtrack that sounds very similar, or is it the other direction?
I think it kind of goes back and forth. It kind of depends on who gets in there first, especially if you're working with a sound team that's doing their own sound design and you're the composer sort of coming in after them, or if they're coming in after you, like everyone kind of has to sort of feel out the space, right, sonically. So yeah, it's definitely sort of a game of not stepping on each other's toes. There's sort of a general, like if there's a game, for example, with like VO for voice acting, like avoiding the sonic range of a human voice to kind of allow for those things to pop through. Similarly, if there's like a very specific UI tonality, if the UI sounds are in a certain key, and they should always be in one key, for all the sound designers out there, please do not have dissonant sound design. And then also for composers, don't write in a key that conflicts with the UI, because there's been a lot of games I've run into where it's like you've got this beautiful background music, and then suddenly the UI comes up and it's like, and just like totally at odds with the key that the music's being played in. It's just terrible. So yeah, it's really just that sort of cross communication and sort of who's going in first, who's not going to step on each other's toes. Yeah, you had a question? Yeah.
Okay, so when writing music for film,
Yeah.
you talked about some things like the ensemble that you decided. It's very similar, in my opinion, to writing for film, where you the composer chooses whatever instrumentation goes with that film, to enhance the mood of the character, or the scene, or whatever.
Yeah.
And then writing to the picture, writing to the scene,
Yeah.
is what a film composer would do.
Right.
So how does composing for games differ from, or do you ever write literally to the scene of what's happening in the game? How is that different from film scoring?
Yeah, so for film scoring, that the defining factor, right, is that you are writing a linear piece of music for a linear medium. So you're writing, essentially equivocating what is being shown on screen and enhancing that experience. For a game, you don't know what is exactly going to be on the screen unless you're writing for a cutscene. So if you're writing for a cutscene, then you're just doing film scoring, essentially. But if you are writing music that can be played back at any point, it's essentially taking all of the possibilities that could be happening while the music is playing and sort of accommodating those. And the main choices to be made is not necessarily like, going along with the picture, but figuring out when the music needs to change, what elements are impacting how the score is reacting to the changes in the experience, and how closely or how loosely you want to tie those together. Any other questions, or is this it? Going once, going twice. All right, cool, that's it. Thank you so much.